For as much as an impact as psychology has had on popular culture and the world at large, it's a relatively new discipline, at least when you think of psychology as its modern definition. Not only that, but plenty of psychological experiments have had fascinating results documenting the predictability of human behavior and at the same time pushing it to its very limits. However, there's a dark side of psychology, and given how new the modern discipline is, many experiments that have happened as recently as the 60s and 70s were so unethical that they warrant a creepy iceberg chart. With that brief introduction, allow me to get straight into the psychological experiments iceberg, created by an edgy pie. However, before I get into that, spare me 10 seconds of self-promotion. This may be my last video of 2022, and I'd love to see as much engagement as humanly possible. If you enjoy this video, please like, comment, and subscribe, and also consider checking out the rest of my channel, where I have plenty of icebergs, including some very creepy ones. Also, if you want to be a part of the Seed Butter community, please consider joining the Discord, the link to which is in the description. Thank you for tuning in, and let's begin. Pavlov's dog experiment. We're going to begin this iceberg with what is potentially the most well-known psychological experiment ever, and for good reason. Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist known for his legendary contribution to the field, the discovery of classical conditioning. Pavlov was studying dog salivation when eating when he discovered that the dogs would actually begin to salivate when his assistant was walking over with the food, even though the food wasn't there yet, meaning that the dogs were displaying a sort of anticipatory reaction and hoping for the food. After looking into this phenomenon, Pavlov realized that the dogs would salivate in response to quite literally any object that the dogs associated with food, something that he would later call a conditioned stimulus. After more and more sets of these experiments with dogs and food, Pavlov eventually came to his iconic finale, where he paired a bell with the presentation of food, and dogs would be conditioned into associating that bell with the food, and they'd salivate at the bell tone, in a process that he called classical conditioning. Piaget glass experiment. The Piaget glass experiment showed that when water is transferred between two containers in front of a child, when those containers have different dimensions, giving the illusion that one is bigger than the other, the child can't realize that there's the same amount of water in each container. It's not a wild experiment by any means, but it basically showed that children don't have the ability to realize conversion until they're about 7 years old, typically. Skinner's box. Skinner's box is another iconic piece of psychological history. Skinner's box, or an operant conditioning box, is an apparatus used to discover operant conditioning, which is similar to classical conditioning but achieves association in different ways, mainly through punishment or reward. In a Skinner box, an animal has to respond to either lights or switches to get a reward, which is typically food. This is known as positive reinforcement. The reward could also be the removal of a loud noise or a smelly odor, which is negative reinforcement. Operant conditioning established different types of reinforcements and punishments, which are used very commonly today, even when raising children, whether the parents know it or not. Asch conformity experiments. The Asch conformity experiments were a series of experiments designed to see whether or not a person would change their behavior to match the majority of people around them, even when that behavior was out of place. The first experiment of this type tested college students in a task where they were given 2 cards and had to identify which of 3 lines matched the length of the first card. One subject was placed in a room with actors who, after giving the right answer a few times, would all begin to give what was clearly the wrong answer. And in the first experiment, 36.8% of people would start giving the wrong answers, and in debriefing interviews they often said they just did so to go along with the group. These types of tests have been done and redone over the years, changing the situation and variables, but the primary idea remains the same. People will often change their behavior to match up with others, which is fascinating. Sally Ann experiments. The Sally Ann experiments are very interesting experiments that, while not necessarily conclusive, have provided a lot of valuable information in the field of autism research. The experiment has been done in different ways, but the most well-known study happened when researchers set up dolls and presented it to children who either had autism, Down syndrome, or were clinically unimpaired controls. The story goes like this. This is Sally. Sally has a basket. This is Ann. Ann has a box. Sally has a marble, and she puts the marble into her basket. Sally goes out for a walk. Ann takes the marble out of the basket and puts it into the box. Now Sally comes back. She wants to play with her marble, so where will she look for the marble? The children are finally asked where Sally looks for the marble. If they correctly answer that Sally will look in her own basket, that should mean that they understand the difference between their own personal perspective and the perspective of Sally. While children with Down syndrome and unimpaired controls typically answered the question correctly, only a very small percentage of children with autism answered the question right. Now, there are some criticisms of this story suggesting that perhaps the children with autism didn't understand the question or couldn't necessarily communicate an effective answer, but regardless, the results are telling of how people with autism might think when they're that young, and how they might be less likely to form perspectives from the minds of other people. Marshmallow Experiment. The Stanford Marshmallow Experiment was a 1972 study about delayed gratification, basically a reward that isn't immediate but is greater, and how children think about that concept. Psychologist Walter Mitchell would tell kids that they could either have one marshmallow or a pretzel, depending on their preference, or if they waited a bit, they could have two. The proctor then left the room for about 15 minutes and returned. Now, here's what's really interesting. The scientists kept track of which kids were able to wait 15 minutes for a larger reward and which ones didn't. They were then able to conclude years later that the children who waited had better life outcomes, from higher SAT scores to lower BMIs and to higher educational outcomes as a whole. Now, the main criticism of this study is that perhaps economic background has a bigger impact on these outcomes, and when the study was replicated with a more diverse population later on, the results weren't quite as strong, but they still existed, which is fascinating. The halo effect experiments. The halo effect is the idea that positive impressions of someone, whether it be them looking attractive in photos or being very personable, can override our impression of them, even if they've done something very bad. Thorndike, who coined the term, did so during experiments in 1920, where he interviewed military officers about their impressions of certain subordinates. Now, the commanding officer hadn't actually spoken to the subordinates in question, but if he were asked about a subordinate who happened to look attractive, be taller, or more muscular, for example, he was more likely to rate that man as a better soldier, without knowing a single thing about him. Similarly, soldiers who were shorter or uglier were rated as being worse soldiers. It's a fascinating example of how cognitive bias can be extended to all sorts of areas. MKUltra. MKUltra is a disturbing project that, while I won't cover in crazy detail today, could be talked about for hours and hours. MKUltra was run by the CIA from 1953 to 73, fueled by Cold War paranoia, with the main objective being able to weaken an individual and force a confession out of them through various forms of torture, as well as investigating mind control. This research included shocking people, forcing them to take drugs, abuse, hypnosis, and isolation. The project was born out of Nazi and Japanese research during World War II on mind control, and insanely, Nazi researchers were actually hired by the CIA to assist CIA workers on how to force drugs onto people. The most well-known drug associated with MKUltra was LSD, as for a time the CIA thought it was the key to mind control. Participants were recruited from prisons, mental hospitals, and also included drug addicts and prostitutes. Basically, people who had zero recourse against being experimented on and who could easily be picked up and dropped off with no one to help them. Perhaps most interestingly, which we'll talk about in detail later, the CIA set up fake brothels so that they could obtain participants who would be unwilling to go to the authorities for help due to the embarrassment of admitting that they had gone to see prostitutes. They were then given LSD. Drug addicts found on the streets were promised free drugs if they took LSD. Other drugs forced on people included mescaline, DMT, AMT, cocaine, and psilocybin. Sadly, during a panic brought on by Watergate, the CIA destroyed most documents about this project, and although 20,000 survived, a full investigation is impossible. You can go insanely deep into this subject, but it's fairly well known, and there are better explanations here on YouTube than I could provide right now. Learned helplessness. Learned helplessness isn't an experiment per se, rather a condition that people or animals can fall into after being exposed to aversive stimuli beyond their control over enough time. In some experiments with dogs, which I won't get too much into because they're kind of sad, dogs that were shocked at random would basically give up trying to escape the pain and would just resign to it, and they only made an effort to escape after being explicitly shown how to by researchers, who physically moved the dogs off of a shock pad into a safe zone. The concept has been connected to depression and other mental illnesses in humans, who might be giving up on getting better because they believe that they have zero control over a situation. Little Albert. Little Albert is an insanely controversial experiment regarding phobias and classical conditioning, for good reason. The purpose of this experiment was to show evidence of classical conditioning in humans. Using a 9-month-old infant with no known mental issues, the experimenters basically let the kid play with a rat, and when he did so, they would smack a piece of steel with a hammer right next to the baby's head so it made a loud noise, causing the child to, expectedly, get scared and start sobbing. After doing this enough times, the rat would eventually cry at the presentation of the rat alone, without the loud noise, because the rat had become a conditioned stimulus, and the child paired the rat with a loud, scary noise. Later on, the child demonstrated stimulus generalization, becoming scared of things that looked like a rat, such as a dog or a rabbit. This experiment is iconic in psychology, but naturally criticized. The research is important, but could never be done today. Though the identity of little Albert is disputed, there was no follow-up study with him, and it's been suggested that the film of this study was actually manipulated a bit as well. Regardless, it's very well known and talked about in the psychological world. The Facebook experiment. For 1 week in 2012, Facebook attempted to experiment on negatively manipulating people's emotions. About 700,000 people, actually. Those chosen for this experiment were shown content that was defined as either predominantly happy or angry, and after this 1-week phase of content being shown, unknowing participants were more likely to use words that were either angry or happy based on the content that had been shown to them. This was actually turned into a paper called Experimental Evidence of Massive-Scale Emotional Contagion Through Social Networks. And while this form of data collection was entirely legal, there's a big debate over whether or not it was ethical. But I'll read a particularly interesting piece of the paper. We show, via a massive experiment on Facebook, that emotional states can be transferred to others via emotional contagion, leading people to experience the same emotions without their awareness. We provide experimental evidence that emotional contagion occurs without direct interaction between people. Exposure to a friend expressing an emotion is sufficient, and in the complete absence of nonverbal cues. So not only was Facebook able to easily manipulate people's emotions, but it seemed to spread from person to person, which is just as fascinating. The Mother Experiments. I believe this entry refers to Harry Harlow's experiments on the idea of motherhood in monkeys. While there are a couple of these, what Harlow typically did was take macaw monkeys and create fake mothers for them that were made out of wire. The monkeys began to recognize their own mothers and would cling to them. The most well-known part of this research was when Harlow would give the monkeys 2 mothers, one that was wiry and uncomfortable but had milk, and the other which had no milk but was warm and cozy. Even when the cozy mom couldn't provide nourishment, the monkeys still preferred clinging to it, which is kind of adorable. The Stanford Prison Experiment. This is another experiment that entire books have literally been written on, and I'll just have to touch on briefly here. It took place over 6 days in 1971 and was constructed by Philip Zimbardo, a psychologist who has done loads of interesting experiments. Though this is certainly his most well-known, and it's honestly perhaps the most well-known psychological experiment of all time. Participants were given roles as either guards or prisoners, and the experiment began when the prisoners were actually arrested by Palo Alto police and brought to a fake jail, where the guards, who were given no rules on how exactly to keep the prisoners contained, acted increasingly brutal to their fellow participants. The guards gave the prisoners little food, made them relieve themselves in buckets, and forced them to exercise. Zimbardo had to cut the experiment off after day 6 that was supposed to take a full 2 weeks. I encourage you to watch this video if you want some more info on it. It's a fascinating topic. The Milgram Experiments. The Milgram experiments were conducted by Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram. These experiments set out to answer a very important question. Why did so many people follow brutal orders in Nazi Germany? Are people really that subservient to authority? He designed an experiment where a participant believed that they were participating in a different experiment, where they would deliver shocks to a learner at the instruction of a scientist. Now, these shocks weren't real, but the participant would flip a switch and then hear a pre-recorded scream come from an adjacent room. The shocks got more and more powerful until they finally hit a level that would be fatal in humans. If the participant tried to stop, the scientist would say one of the 4 commands in an increasing order. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you must continue. You have no other choice, you must go on. If the participant said no all 4 times, then the experiment would truly end. However, get this. 65% of participants delivered the final shock, which was labeled as severe shock on the experimental apparatus. The other 35% of participants delivered at least 300 volts, which, though being close to fatal, isn't quite. These results were astounding to say the least. Interestingly, participants became very uncomfortable during the experiment, some sweating or biting their fingers or lips, some even bursting into episodes of hysteric laughter. But they still followed orders. Many experiments similar to this have been repeated with similar results. People listen to authority figures, even if it means doing something they clearly don't want to do. Cerletti's experiments. Ugo Cerletti was an Italian psychologist who discovered the use of electroconvulsive therapy for mental disorders that couldn't be cured by other means. He came up with this idea after going to a butcher shop and seeing pigs be shocked before their slaughter. He paired that with the current treatment for certain mental disorders, which was a seizure induced by drugs. He experimented on animals and eventually humans by shocking them to induce a seizure. Surprisingly, it actually worked, and for the time was relatively safe. It could be used on patients with schizophrenia and manic depression, and after his initial experiments, it became the de facto therapy for these disorders around the world. Naturally, better treatments have come out that have since phased out ECT, which, though generally considered inhumane, is still used very infrequently in clinical practice today to treat severe depression. David Reimer. This story is incredibly disgusting, so I'll only be covering bits of it for sake of not getting demonetized, so just bear with me. David Reimer was a Canadian man who lived an extremely tragic life, and his story has been influential in the field of psychology and also research into gender and sexuality. After Reimer was born in 1965, he was taken by doctors to be circumcised, though during his circumcision, the area was destroyed beyond repair, like entirely. Doctors and psychologists consulted his parents, who suggested raising him as a female. Throughout David's childhood, he resisted this label, realizing he was a boy around the age of 9 to 11, and by age 15 he was fully presenting himself as a male. Now, David, who was originally named Bruce at birth, had a twin brother named Brian, who becomes important later. The parents of these twins took David to a psychologist named John Money, who was studying gender identity at the time, and who also believed that gender identity was not innate whatsoever and was entirely socialized. This is where it gets absolutely disgusting. Money suggested that they perform surgery on David, who was at the time being called Brenda, so that he would have full female anatomy. After this, Money took the twins and experimented on them until they were 13. Some of the experiments involved Money forcing the twins to act out what I'll only refer to as gender-affirming play, that you can look into at Wikipedia to learn more about, and would literally scream at them if they didn't obey his every word. Both twins talked about how traumatizing the experiment was, and Brian died of a drug overdose at 36, while David took his own life at 38. Before his tragic end, David Reimer dedicated his life to advocating against practices like this. Unfortunately, this type of thing could never happen again, at least legally. But it's quite literally one of the most disgusting cases I can think of on this list, for what was done to the twins, which, again, I can't even really fully talk about on YouTube. 3 identical strangers. Keeping up with the themes of twins and sadness, we're now going to look at the story of Edward Galland, David Kellman, and Robert Shafran. Before I get into this though, I'm going to explain the concept of nature versus nurture in like 2 sentences. Nature versus nurture is a big concept in psychology. Debate isn't really the right word, but it's essentially the question of whether or not people are made up by their genetics or their environment, thus nature being your genes and nurture being your environment and how you're raised. Now the answer lies somewhere in the middle. Oftentimes, for example, twins separated at birth have similar personality characteristics, though at the same time, being active and deliberate in how you raise someone can very much shape what they think and how they act. It's a very complicated concept, but that's all you need to know for this entry. Now, 3 Identical Strangers is a movie about these 3 triplets who were intentionally separated at birth and placed in a poor, middle-class, and upper-class family as a cruel experiment. Now, spoiler alert, all 3 of these boys had mental health struggles and one actually took their own life. So yeah, experimenting on babies doesn't really end up well. Anyways, going with the nature versus nurture theme, the boys had many similarities, and when they met up by chance, became great friends. A perfect example of nature versus nurture here was that 2 of the boys had the same eye condition, but only one of them got treated for it, presumably due to being placed in a richer family. Currently, the science behind this study is locked away at Yale until 2065, probably so that all the people involved in this study will have passed by then. So there's a lot more questions than answers when it comes to this topic, like what conclusions the researchers actually came to, but hopefully we'll get to find out in the future. Rosenhan experiment. The Rosenhan experiment, conducted by David Rosenhan, a professor at Stanford in 1973, involved him and 8 others pretending to have hallucinations to be admitted into different psychiatric hospitals, where they immediately dropped their faked symptoms and acted normally. Not only was every single participant admitted into the hospital, but every single one of them was diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder. Before they could leave, the participants were all described antipsychotics and were forced to admit that they had a mental illness. Now, after this happened, Rosenhan dropped the ball, explained the situation, and embarrassed these doctors. The hospitals reached out to Rosenhan, challenging him to send more fake patients to their hospitals, and Rosenhan, who wasn't quite done messing with these doctors, agreed. In a few weeks, 193 people were admitted into the challenging hospitals, 41 of which were identified as phonies. Rosenhan did not send a single person. The purpose of this study was to see whether or not psychiatric diagnoses were reliable, which Rosenhan concluded was not the case, saying, quote, "It is clear that we cannot distinguish the sane from the insane in psychiatric hospitals," and pointed out the dangers and dehumanization that comes from being in one of these facilities, advocating for the use of communal mental health facilities, which, wow, that's actually an insane conclusion. This guy was way ahead of his time and committed to his work. It's a pretty funny entry, but it reveals a very big problem at the same time. The Tea Room Sex Study. The Tea Room Sex Study refers to American sociologist Laud Humphrey's 1968 PhD dissertation titled Tea Room Trade, a study of homosexual encounters in public places. The dissertation studied various men who had gay encounters in public bathrooms. Basically, back in the day, there's a practice called tea rooming, where 2 men would go into the bathroom, have an encounter, usually somewhere at a restaurant, where a third person, called the watch queen, which comes from gay slang, would keep lookout and make sure no one interrupted them. The 3 men would communicate with each other using hand signals, and the watch queen would be paid for looking out for the other 2. Now you can probably guess what Humphrey did. Humphrey posed as a watch queen so he could study these gay encounters. He usually didn't make his intentions clear with the men, and critically, he would follow them out of the restaurants and write down their license plates so he could track them down and get more information out of them. Then he turned this research into a book called Tea Room Trade: Impersonal Sex in Public Places. In the course of his research, he got all sorts of information about these men, which had a big effect on the psychological field. First off, this research was actually very helpful for the gay community because it disproved a lot of myths about gay men and helped turn authorities away from policing crimes like this. However, it has become known as a lesson in researching ethics and basically stands as a reminder for researchers not to violate people's privacy like this ever again. Jane Elliott's school cases. Jane Elliott is an American diversity educator widely known for experiments she conducted in a 3rd grade class while she was a school teacher. Right after MLK was assassinated, Elliott began this classroom experiment where she told students that kids with brown eyes were better than students with blue eyes. The students protested, and Elliott doubled down, saying that there was scientific evidence that these students were smarter. For a whole week, the students deemed superior became more confident, arrogant, bossy, and actually performed better on tests and exercises, whereas the other group transformed into more timid children who isolated themselves during playtime and scored poorly on tests. The next week, Elliott reversed the exercise. And though the results weren't quite as dramatic, both groups were able to completely have the opposite effects, believing that they were either inferior or superior after what had happened the previous week. Bystander effect experiments. The bystander effect is the tendency for people to ignore someone in need of help when there are other people around. It was popularized after the case of Kitty Genovese, a woman who was murdered in front of her home in the vicinity of 38 neighbors who each did nothing to help her. A man stabbed her in the back twice as she approached her door, and a neighbor yelled at the man, scaring him off, but then stopped. Kitty lay there screaming, and still no one helped. 10 minutes later, the man returned, seeing his victim basically unconscious, and decided to kill her, assault her body, and take her money. And though at some point someone called the police, it was far too late to save her. So why did no one help? And would others help out in a similar situation? Various experiments have been designed to test this idea, but the most iconic was the original constructed by social psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané in 1968. The experiment worked like this. Participants were told that they would listen to other participants speak for 2 minutes over a microphone, but each participant was in a separate room. However, there aren't really multiple people. Each participant is listening to a pre-recorded voice. At some point, the participant would hear a voice of someone having a seizure, which sounded something like this: "I'm having a fit. Help me." "Oh my God, if someone could just help me out here, I can't breathe properly. I'm going to die." So how many participants stood up and left the room when they heard this? All of them, right? Wrong. In the original experiment, only 31% of people actually got up to help because they all assumed that someone else would. Even if participants showed symptoms of anxiety, this wasn't enough to get them actually moving to get help. The third wave. The third wave might be the most fascinating entry on this iceberg today, so stay tuned. This was another experiment showing how surprisingly attractive fascism can be for people. The third wave was a fake social movement created by Ron Jones, a California high school teacher in 1967. While teaching his students about the Holocaust, he found them unable to believe his explanations as to why the German people were so complacent, so he decided to demonstrate it to them himself. Here's how it went. On day 1, Jones walked into the room and wrote "Strength through discipline" on the board. He enforced extremely strict posture and etiquette rules, drilling them on how well they responded to these seemingly ludicrous ideas. On day 2, surprised by how well the students listened on the previous day, Jones added a second phrase to the board, "Strength through community," and described to his students a movement called the third wave. Jones named the movement based on the supposition that the third wave in a row is the strongest, and he taught the students a salute gesture where you would bring a cupped hand across your chest. Students were told to greet each other with this salute in and out of class, and were given assignments like making third wave propaganda or recruiting new members. By day 3, the number of third wave members had increased from the first 30 students in the class to 43. Jones added the phrase "strength through action" to the board. He gave students membership cards and created initiation rules. It spread throughout the high school like wildfire, and by the end of the day, there were 200 new members. Jones told the members to report to him when other members failed third wave etiquette, and surprisingly, Jones received around 20 reports in just a day from students snitching on one another. The students literally then put their own peers on trial for not abiding by the rules, and punished them in ways like banishing them to the library. Day 4. Jones tries to stop the experiment, which had spiraled out of control. Students had created a third wave bodyguard division and physically assaulted dissenting students working for the school newspaper. After realizing he couldn't stop it, Jones doubled down, announcing that the third wave was a nationwide movement and that the next day the third wave president would announce himself to the public, ordering students to attend a rally the next day. On the final day, students arrived to the rally early. Jones had brought friends to pose as reporters and interview the kids who, all on their own, were chanting, "Strength through discipline, strength through community, strength through action." Jones directed the students' attention to a TV where the president would make his announcement, and once the group fell silent, he let the cat out of the bag. He explained that the students had been part of an experiment on fascism and ended the rally by showing a film about Nazism. The Good Samaritan Experiment. The Good Samaritan Experiment was conducted by behavioral scientists John Darley and Daniel Baston, working at Princeton University. Curious about prosocial behavior, the researchers wanted to know what drove people to do good. And what better sample than students at the Princeton Theological Seminary, or basically students training to be priests. They began by recruiting the participants and questioning them about their dedication to their religion. Finally, they were told to prepare a speech about the story of the Good Samaritan and that they would present it soon. They were told to give the sermon at a nearby building, but based on random assignment, they were either given plenty of time, or they were told that they were on time but needed to leave immediately, or they were told that they would be late and needed to rush. They all followed the same path to a building where a stage actor was pretending to be injured. Here's what happened. Interestingly, the self-reported dedication to God didn't affect the results. However, the amount of time they had to give their sermon did. 63% of participants who had plenty of time stopped to help the man. Of those who had some time, only 45% stopped. And of those running late, only 10% stopped. Ignoring the irony of the fact that these soon-to-be priests were about to give a talk about being a good Samaritan, it's insane how low the percentage was of those who stopped to help. Cave of Thieves Experiment. The Cave of Thieves experiment, also known as the Robbers Cave experiment, occurred in 1954 when researcher Muzaffer Sharif and his colleagues wanted to study group conflict. Taking a boys' summer camp of 11 to 12-year-olds, they divided the boys into two groups, Eagles and Rattlers. The experiment took place in two phases. In the first, the groups were separated and had no knowledge of each other. In the second, they had both been made aware of the other group and they were forced to compete with them. When both groups learned about each other, they instantly started talking negatively about the other group after they had learned that they needed to compete. As the researchers had told them, they would play games like tug-of-war for a prize at the end of the camp. Tensions between the two groups quickly rose. Each team burned the other's team flag and raided their cabins. The researchers sent out surveys to the boys who began rating their opponents as negative and their teammates as extremely positive. Not only that, but on their own, each group became more cohesive internally. In an effort to look into conflict reduction, the researchers did things like group dinners for both teams, but they quickly spiraled into food fights between the Eagles and Rattlers. While that didn't work, the researchers discovered that there was something that could reduce conflict between the groups: superordinate goals. The researchers did things like pretend the camp's water had broken, or that a tree broke down and needed to be pulled with ropes, forcing the boys to work together. Over time, as large goals pressed both groups, the tension began to ease between them. The boys stopped calling each other names, and surveys showed a reduction in hostility towards their previous opponents. At the end of the summer, the boys volunteered to ride home on one bus, and one group bought drinks for the other. Emma Eckstein. Emma Eckstein was an Austrian author and patient of Sigmund Freud, who also helped him as a collaborator. I won't get too far into her story because a lot of what she and Freud did is just weird. However, she was instrumental in the development of Freud's seduction theory. The Bobo doll experiment. The Bobo doll experiment refers to a set of experiments conducted by Albert Bandura to test his social learning theory. It involved him beating the crap out of a Bobo doll in front of a kid and then leaving. And lo and behold, the kid usually started to beat up the doll as well. Further variations of this study also showed the adult being punished, rewarded, or ignored for their behavior towards the doll, and then examining the child's behavior, showing practical research about not only how we learn through imitation, but how we learn through seeing the consequences of others. Monster study. The monster study was an extremely unethical experiment on stuttering that took place in Iowa in 1939, using 22 orphans as participants and constructed by Wendell Johnson. It was dubbed the monster study by some of his colleagues because of how horrified they were to see him experiment on orphan children. The results of the study were actually kept hidden for a while because Johnson feared that his reputation would be tarnished, as news was coming out about Nazi experiments happening at the time, so this never got published in a journal. Johnson split the orphans into two groups, giving one positive reinforcement on the speech, while the other group was belittled for any imperfections in their speech. While none of the orphans showed any signs of speech deficits before the experiment, many children in the negative group retained speech issues for the rest of their lives. The main issue here, ethically speaking, was that these kids clearly weren't providing informed consent, and the University of Iowa publicly apologized for this study in 2001. Interestingly, though, this research has been labeled as groundbreaking by some in the field who, while recognizing the ethical problems, understand that this study provided some of the first knowledge about stuttering and continues to influence the practice of speech therapy to this day. Asali experiment. The Asali experiment refers to the Asali, a raft that's set to sea with 11 people on it on a sociology experiment with the purpose of understanding relationships in isolation. It's a fascinating story, and the experiment basically went totally wrong, and there's a great video by Wendigoon if you want to check that out. Essentially, there was just a lot of drama, and the participants ended up beginning to hate the sociologist who started the study, but I won't get too deep into it right here. Facial expression experiments. I believe this entry refers to the Carney Landis experiment of 1924, where Landis, a grad student at Minnesota University, was interested in discovering what exact facial muscles would contract when a person experienced a particularly strong emotion. This happened during a phase of the psychological world where people were often studying the James Lange theory of emotion, which essentially states that bodily changes prompt emotion, not the other way around. So Landis was curious to see what exactly the body would do before an emotional state set in. He set up an experiment where he would draw lines on people's faces to help identify the muscle, then took photos of them during certain conditions. In the beginning, Landis made the volunteers do very simple tasks, but when they didn't react enough, he raised the stakes. For example, he shot a gun near the participant to try and capture the facial image of shock, but he still wasn't getting the results he wanted. He then upped the stakes again, forcing the subjects to rummage through a bucket of live frogs until they found an electrical wire at the bottom that would shock them. After this, he put a mouse in one hand of the participant and a knife in the other, ordering them to kill the mouse or that he would kill it for them. The participants were horrified, sure, but they didn't quite show one facial expression. Some people broke into hysterical laughter, others swore, some cried, and others just froze. Horrifically, one of these participants was a 13-year-old boy who was only part of the experiment because he was a patient in the department who was easy to recruit. The results of this experiment show that there isn't necessarily one facial expression that perfectly corresponds to a given emotion, but that took a whole lot of traumatizing work to get to that conclusion. Operation Midnight Climax. Operation Midnight Climax was a CIA program associated with MKUltra discussed earlier. The objective of this operation was to test LSD on non-consenting individuals to grant CIA research in the field of mind control. Prostitutes would lure men to CIA facilities where they were given cocktails of illicit substances. A Senate investigation revealed that this data was supposed to help U.S. intelligence by gaining mind control over spies and potentially even poisoning entire buildings with strange substances. Curiously, it's likely that some CIA agents recreationally used some of the drugs and prostitutes during the operation. UCLA schizophrenia experiments. A UCLA study titled Developmental Processes in Schizophrenic Disorders, which began in 1983 and is still going to this day, has been subject to scrutiny over informed consent and potential dangers to participants. This came to light in 1991 when a man named Tony LaMadrid, who had schizophrenia and was part of the research, jumped off a 9-story building, and a federal investigation ensued. Essentially, the research involved taking these patients off their medications and letting them relapse to see what would happen, which in the case of many, including LaMadrid, was very detrimental to their health. The Pit of Despair. The Pit of Despair, which we mentioned earlier, was a device made by Harry Harlow to produce depressed monkeys to research, depression. Baby monkeys were placed in the chamber for weeks, huddling in corners and eventually growing to be psychotic, and typically, they never recovered. Even into adulthood, these monkeys had all sorts of problems, being unable to socialize or raise young, for example. Loretta Bender's experiments. Loretta Bender was a child neuropsychiatrist known for her research in child development and suggesting that childhood disorders had much to do with biology and not just necessarily how one was raised. I believe this entry refers to the experiments she did on children with schizophrenia, where she gave children younger than 12 electroconvulsive therapy. She also did research into using insulin and LSD to combat schizophrenia, which was pretty controversial. The Monkey Drug Trials. The Monkey Drug Trials refers to a 1969 experiment where researchers attempted to see if a monkey could get addicted to drugs and self-administer them. To begin, monkeys were injected with drugs like cocaine, meth, and morphine, and the experimenters created an apparatus that allowed the monkeys to give the drugs to themselves, and consequently, the monkeys did become psychologically dependent on these drugs. And this research was pretty useful because at the time, people didn't necessarily completely believe that humans could form psychological dependence on drugs, so this research did start the conversation about how to potentially treat drug users medically. Mouse Utopia. The Mouse Utopia experiment started in 1968 when biologist John Calhoun built a large pen to house a mouse colony. He designed a world where mice could live in this grand pen, which had 256 individual apartments and was free from disease and predators. The experiment began with just 8 mice, but by 19 months there were over 2,000 mice living there. Without natural resources of violence to eliminate overpopulation, a problematic number of young mice began to emerge. You see, mice fight for social dominance, and those that lose often just scurry away somewhere, but that wasn't an option in Mouse Utopia. So large groups of these weaker mice, which Calhoun called dropouts, would gather at the center of the pen and just fight and cannibalize one another. The alpha males tried to protect their families in the small apartments, but had to give up due to the sheer number of attackers. Mothers abandoned their pups too early, and the mice were being raised without proper social interactions, eventually leading to them being unable to procreate or raise their young. And this problem spiraled until eventually, less than 5 years after the experiment began, the entire population went extinct. Experimental ECT at Auschwitz. I won't get in too deep about this one because the medical abuses committed under Nazi Germany are just a huge topic that I'm not really qualified to talk about, but this entry specifically refers to electroconvulsive therapy, which was experimented on in that setting, and as you could probably guess, it was unethical and disgusting. Project QK Hilltop. Project QK Hilltop was a CIA experiment on, you guessed it, mind control, that took place in 1954. It studied brainwashing techniques used by the Chinese, and many of these studies took place at Cornell University under Dr. Harold Wolff. Not much is known about these experiments, though the program was eventually absorbed by MKUltra. We do, however, have copies of letters sent from Wolff to the CIA, which read that he requested any CIA information on things like torture and brainwashing, and even requested that the CIA make subjects available to him. The Aversion Project. The Aversion Project was an experiment that happened in South Africa during the apartheid era, where Dr. Aubrey Levin worked to identify gay conscripts and rid them of their sexuality. Castrations and shock therapy were common, and a technique often used was showing pictures of men before shocking the individual to make them averse to what they might find attractive. Obviously, this didn't work, but it was one of the first examples of an attempted conversion therapy. Project Artichoke. Project Artichoke was the predecessor to MKUltra, so again, we can't say much about what actually went down, but we do know that the primary goal here was to produce someone who might involuntarily commit an assassination. It studied the use of drugs as well as manipulating diseases to weaken one's ability to resist mind control. Spooky, to say the least. Okay guys, thanks for tuning in to my last Iceberg of 2022. I hope that if you liked this video, you'll stick around by subscribing to the Seed Butter channel and maybe checking out my other stuff. If you got this far and enjoyed the video, please consider joining my Discord. Thanks again for your attention today, and I hope you enjoyed this creepy iceberg. There's plenty more on the way, I promise you. Thanks again, and have a good night.